They expected the worst. When German women prisoners heard boots echoing down the hallway after midnight at Camp Ruston, Louisiana in December 1945, their hearts stopped. Some grabbed their thin blankets tight, others whispered prayers in the darkness. They had been told stories. Stories about what American guards did to prisoners in the night. Stories about cruelty, about punishment, about things too terrible to speak out loud. But when the heavy door swung open and flashlights swept across the frozen barracks, the guards were not carrying weapons. They were carrying blankets. Thick wool blankets that smelled like fresh laundry. And as each woman received one pressed into her shaking hands, something inside them broke. Not from violence, but from an unexpected kindness that shattered everything they thought they knew about their captors. If you find this story moving, please like and subscribe for more true accounts from World War II. These forgotten moments deserve to be remembered. It started in the ruins of Hamburg, 3 weeks after Germany surrendered. Greta Hoffmann, age 23, stood in line with 200 other women wearing the tattered remains of Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms. The Helferinnen, they had been called. Radio operators, clerks, nurses, cooks, young women who had served the German military in non-combat roles. Now they were prisoners. The morning was cold. Gray clouds hung low over the bombed-out city. Around them, Hamburg lay in pieces, buildings reduced to hollow shells, streets buried under rubble. The smell of burned wood and something worse, something chemical and dead, hung in the air. Children watched from broken doorways as the women were loaded onto American trucks. Their faces were thin, their eyes were old. Greta clutched a small cloth bag containing everything she still owned in the world. One change of underclothes, a bent spoon, a photograph of her mother. The truck engines roared to life and they began to move through the destroyed streets. Nobody spoke. Some women cried quietly, others stared straight ahead with empty eyes. An older woman named Margaret sat next to Greta. She had gray streaks in her brown hair and deep lines around her mouth. She had been a hospital administrator in Berlin before the war reached the city. Now she was just another prisoner, wearing a dirty gray uniform jacket with missing buttons. "They will send us to America," Margaret whispered. "I heard the guards talking." America? Greta could barely process the word. America was so far away, so impossible. It was the enemy nation, the one they had been taught to fear and hate. "What will they do to us there?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "Nothing good. The Nazis told us what Americans do to prisoners, especially to women." Her voice dropped even lower. "We should prepare ourselves." That phrase stayed with Greta as they were transferred from trucks to trains, then from trains to ships in Bremen Harbor. Prepare ourselves. What did that even mean? How do you prepare for cruelty? How do you steel your heart against humiliation? The ship was a converted cargo vessel. The women were led down narrow metal stairs into a hold below deck. The space was dim and smelled of rust and oil. Bunk beds lined the walls, stacked 3 high. Each woman was assigned a number and a bed. Greta got number 147 in a top bunk near the back corner. That first night on the ship, as the engines rumbled and the Atlantic swells rocked them back and forth, many women got seasick. The smell became terrible. Some vomited into buckets, others lay curled up, moaning softly. But American guards brought crackers and water. They emptied the buckets without complaint. They spoke in calm voices, even though none of the German women could understand English. Greta noticed this. The guards were not brutal, they were not cruel, they were professional, almost bored. This confused her. Where was the hatred she had been promised? Where was the revenge? "Maybe they are saving it for when we reach land," Margaret said darkly. "Maybe then the real punishment begins." 12 days later, the ship reached New Orleans. The women were ordered on deck as the ship pulled into port. Greta stood at the railing and stared. She had never seen anything like it. Buildings that were not destroyed, cars moving on streets, people walking normally like war had never happened. The city was alive. It was whole. It was impossible. The port was busy with activity. Cranes lifted cargo. Workers shouted to each other. Ships from all over the world sat docked side by side. And everywhere there was abundance. Crates of food, barrels of oil, stacks of lumber. The wealth was overwhelming. A woman standing next to Greta started crying. "Look at it all," she whispered. "We were told America was weak, that they were running out of supplies, that they were on the verge of collapse. But look." She gestured at the busy port with a shaking hand. "This does not look like weakness. Hamburg was a graveyard. Berlin was ashes. But here was America, untouched and thriving. The contrast made her dizzy. Or maybe that was still the seasickness. Either way, as she walked down the gangway onto American soil for the first time, Greta felt like she was walking into another world. On the dock, American officials waited with clipboards and documents. The women were processed quickly and efficiently. Names were checked against lists. Numbers were assigned. Medical personnel gave brief examinations to make sure nobody was seriously ill. Everything was organized. Professional. almost boring in its routine normalcy. This was not what they had prepared for. They had expected chaos or brutality. Instead, they got bureaucracy. Forms and stamps and orderly lines. It was disorienting in its mundane efficiency. From New Orleans, buses took them north through Louisiana. Greta pressed her face to the window and watched America roll past. Farmhouses painted white, fields full of crops, towns with intact churches, children playing in yards. Everything looked so normal, so peaceful, like the war had happened on a different planet. The bus was comfortable, better than any transport she had experienced in Germany during the war. The seats were padded. There was enough room. Nobody was crammed in like cargo. Through the window she saw a farmer on a tractor, waving as they passed. She saw a woman hanging laundry in a backyard. She saw children riding bicycles down a dusty road. Ordinary life, untouched by war. It seemed impossible. How could the world contain both this peaceful Louisiana countryside and the ruins of Hamburg? How could both realities exist at the same time? "They have so much," whispered a young woman sitting across from Greta, "and we have nothing. How is that fair?" Nobody answered, because there was no answer, or rather, the answer was too painful to speak aloud. They had lost. Not just the war, but everything. And their enemy had won everything. The evidence rolled past the window, mile after mile of peaceful, prosperous America. They reached Camp Ruston just as the sun was setting. The camp sat in the middle of pine forests, surrounded by double fences topped with barbed wire. Guard towers stood at each corner. Soldiers with rifles watched as the buses pulled through the gates. This part looked familiar. This part looked like a prison. The women were lined up in the yard. An American officer stood on a wooden platform and spoke to them through a translator. They would be registered. They would be given identification numbers. They would follow all camp rules. Any attempts to escape would be dealt with severely. Standard prisoner of war procedures. Then came processing. One by one, the women were called into a long building. When it was Greta's turn, a female guard led her inside. The room was warm. Steam rose from somewhere in the back. Greta's hands began to shake. This is it, she thought. This is where it happens. But the guard just pointed to a bench and said something in English. The translator appeared, a young woman with kind eyes. "Remove your uniform and put it in that basket," the translator said. "You will shower and receive clean clothes." Shower? Greta hesitated. Was this the trap? But what choice did she have? Slowly she undressed, placing her filthy uniform in the basket. The guard handed her a towel, a real towel, thick and white. Then she was led into another room. The shower room had tiled walls and multiple shower heads along one side. Other women were already there, standing nervously under the water. The guard gestured for Greta to join them. She stepped under a shower head and turned the knob, expecting cold water. Hot water poured over her. Actually hot. Steam rose around her shoulders, and there on a small shelf sat a bar of soap. White soap, the kind she had not seen in years. She picked it up with trembling fingers. It was heavy. It smelled like flowers. Greta started to cry. She could not help it. For 2 years she had washed with nothing but cold water and harsh lye soap that left her skin raw. She had picked lice from her hair every night. She had lived in dirt and sweat and the constant smell of unwashed bodies. And now, here in the enemy's prison, she stood under hot water with real soap in her hands. Next to her, Margaret was also crying. So were others. The sound of women weeping echoed off the tiles, mixing with the sound of running water. But these were not tears of pain. They were tears of relief, confusion, and something else. Something harder to name. After the shower, they were given clean clothes. Not uniforms, but simple cotton dresses and undergarments. The dress was dark blue and fit reasonably well. There were even clean socks and sturdy shoes. Greta ran her hands over the fabric. It was soft. It was clean. It was incomprehensible. From the shower building, they were led to a dining hall. The room was large and warm, with long tables and benches. The smell hit Greta immediately. Food. Real food. Her stomach twisted with hunger so intense it hurt. The women lined up at a counter. American soldiers, both men and women, stood behind it with large pots and serving spoons. As each prisoner held out a metal tray, the servers filled it with food. Beef stew, mashed potatoes, thick slices of white bread, an apple, a cup of coffee. Greta stared at her tray. This was more food than she had eaten in a week back in Hamburg, maybe more than she had eaten in a month during that last terrible winter. The bread alone would have been a treasure. The meat was unthinkable. "Is this a trick?" whispered a young woman behind her. "Are they trying to poison us?" An older prisoner, a woman with steel-gray hair, shook her head. "The Geneva Convention. They must feed us properly. It is law." But knowing it was law did not make it feel real. Greta sat at a table with Margaret and 3 other women. For a long moment nobody ate. They just stared at their food like it might disappear. Finally, Margaret picked up her spoon. She dipped it into the stew, lifted it to her mouth, and tasted it. Her eyes went wide. Then she started eating faster, like she could not stop herself. One by one, the others began eating too. Greta took a bite of bread. It was soft and slightly sweet. It dissolved in her mouth like a miracle. She took a bite of potato. It was creamy and rich with butter. Real butter. She had not tasted butter in 3 years. Around the hall, women were crying again. Some were eating and crying at the same time, tears running down their cheeks as they spooned stew into their mouths. Others just sat frozen, staring at their food with expressions of disbelief. An older woman across the table ate slowly, deliberately, as if trying to make each bite last forever. Between bites, she closed her eyes and seemed to be praying. Another woman could not eat at all. She just sat there with her hands pressed against her face, shoulders shaking with sobs. The American cook who had served them watched with a troubled expression. She said something to another guard who shrugged. They did not understand. How could they? They had never known real hunger. They had never watched children die from starvation. They had never eaten grass and bark to survive. Greta thought about her mother and brothers back in Hamburg. Were they alive? Were they eating? The last letter she had received months ago had described their situation. They were living in the basement of a destroyed building. They ate watery soup made from potato peels and whatever weeds they could find. Her youngest brother was sick with a cough that would not go away. And here she sat, the prisoner, eating beef stew with real meat and fresh bread with butter. The wrongness of it was overwhelming. She should be suffering. She should be punished. Instead, she was being fed better than she had been fed in years. "I do not understand," she whispered to Margaret. "Why are they doing this?" Margaret swallowed a mouthful of food and shook her head. "I do not know. Maybe this is how they break us, not with cruelty, but with kindness we cannot refuse. Maybe they want us to feel grateful. Maybe they want us to forget who we are." "But we are still prisoners," Greta said. "Yes," Margaret agreed quietly. "We are still prisoners. But we are fed prisoners. And somehow that makes it worse." After the meal, they were shown to their barracks. Building 14, a long wooden structure with rows of bunk beds on each side. Each woman was assigned a bed. Greta got a lower bunk near a window. On the bed was a mattress with a real pillow and 2 blankets. 2 blankets. Not the thin, rough blankets she remembered from military service. These were thick wool blankets, clean and heavy. She sat on the edge of the bed and ran her hand over the fabric. The mattress was firm but not uncomfortable. The pillow was soft. Around her, women were settling into their spaces. Some sat on their beds looking lost. Others talked in quiet voices. A few were already lying down, exhausted from the journey and the emotional weight of the day. The lights went out at 9 o'clock. In the darkness, Greta lay under her blankets and listened. Outside, she could hear crickets. Inside, she could hear women breathing. Some crying softly, some whispering prayers. But there were no bombs, no sirens, no sounds of war. Just the normal night sounds of a place at peace. She closed her eyes but could not sleep. Her mind kept replaying the day. The hot shower, the soap, the food, the blankets. Every single thing had been the opposite of what she expected. Where was the cruelty? Where was the punishment? Where was the revenge Americans were supposed to want? Next to her bunk, Margaret's voice came out of the darkness. "Greta, are you awake?" "Yes." "I keep thinking about my daughter. She is in Berlin with my sister. They have no heat. They have almost no food. And I am here with blankets and bread and soap." Her voice cracked. "What kind of world is this?" Greta had no answer. She pulled the blanket up to her chin and tried not to think. Eventually, somehow, she fell asleep. The next morning, a bell rang at 6. Greta woke confused, unsure where she was. Then she remembered Louisiana, America, the prisoner camp. She sat up and looked around. Other women were already getting dressed. Light came through the windows. The day had started. They lined up outside for roll call. An American officer and a translator counted them. Then they were marched to the dining hall for breakfast. Oatmeal with brown sugar. Toast with butter and jam. Fresh coffee. An orange. The food kept coming like magic. After breakfast, work assignments were given out. Some women were sent to the kitchen to help prepare food. Others went to the laundry to wash clothes and linens. Some worked in the camp gardens. A few were assigned to clean the administration buildings. The work was not hard. Nothing like the brutal labor they had heard about in concentration camps or Russian prison camps. Greta was assigned to the laundry. She spent her days washing American military uniforms in large machines, then hanging them to dry on lines outside. The work was repetitive but not exhausting. And there was something almost peaceful about it. The smell of clean laundry, the warm steam, the simple rhythm of the tasks. At the end of each week, the women received payment. Not real money, but camp scrip. Paper currency that could only be used at the camp canteen. Greta received her first payment after 5 days of work and stared at the bills in her hand. She was being paid to do laundry. In prison. It made no sense. The payment was not much, $2 of scrip per day. But compared to nothing, compared to the forced labor she had heard about in other camps, it was generous. More importantly, it gave them agency. Choice. The ability to buy small comforts that made life more bearable. "Come," Margaret said, pulling her toward the canteen. "Let us see what they have." The canteen was a small building near the center of camp. Inside, shelves held items for purchase: chocolate bars, cigarettes, writing paper and pencils, soap, toothpaste, combs, even small mirrors and tubes of lipstick. The women crowded around the shelves, touching things with wonder. Greta bought a chocolate bar and a pencil with paper. The chocolate cost 2 scrip dollars. She carried it back to the barracks like it was made of gold. That night she broke off one small square and let it melt on her tongue. The sweetness was almost painful. She had forgotten what chocolate tasted like. Other women bought different things. Some bought cigarettes, even though they had never smoked before. The cigarettes could be traded for other items or simply enjoyed as a small luxury. Others bought writing supplies, desperate to send letters home. A few bought lipstick and spent hours in front of small mirrors, trying to remember what it felt like to care about appearance. These small purchases became deeply meaningful. They represented more than just goods. They represented dignity, the ability to make choices, the possibility of comfort. For women who had spent years with nothing, who had survived on scraps and hope, these simple items were revolutionary. She used the paper to write a letter to her mother. The Red Cross said letters could be sent, though there was no guarantee they would arrive. Greta wrote carefully, trying to explain where she was without explaining too much. She did not want to tell her mother about the food, the soap, the blankets. It would only make things worse. How could she tell her starving family that she was eating 3 meals a day? Weeks passed, then a month. The routine became familiar. Wake at 6, breakfast at 7, work from 8 to 4 with a break for lunch, dinner at 5, free time until lights out at 9, 3 meals every day, each one better than anything they had eaten in the final years of the war. The women began to change. Their faces filled out. Their skin cleared up. Hair that had been dull and brittle became shiny again. They looked healthier, younger, almost normal, and that made the guilt worse. Letters began arriving from home. Not many, and not regularly, but they came. Each one was worse than the last. Greta's mother wrote about the terrible winter, about her brother's cough getting worse, about the American bombing raids that had destroyed what little was left of Hamburg, about standing in line for hours for a single loaf of bread made mostly from sawdust. "We are surviving," her mother wrote, "but barely. I think of you and pray you are safe. I hope wherever you are being treated humanely." Humanely. Greta folded the letter and pressed it against her chest. If only her mother knew. She was being treated better than humanely. She was being treated better than many free Germans. The irony was crushing. Around her, other women shared similar stories. Families living in rubble. Children going hungry. Elderly parents freezing in unheated rooms. The contrast between their suffering homeland and their comfortable captivity grew wider every day. "It is not right," a woman named Helga said one evening. She was crying as she read a letter from her sister. "My niece is 6 years old and weighs as much as a 3-year-old. She has not had milk in 8 months, and I just ate beef and carrots and bread with real butter. It is not right." Nobody disagreed. They all felt it. The shame of being well fed while their families starved. The guilt of being warm while their loved ones froze. The strange, twisted horror of being safe in enemy hands while their own people suffered in their destroyed homeland. But not everything was about guilt and contrast. There were also moments that surprised Greta in different ways. Small interactions that did not fit into any clear category of prisoner and guard. There was a young American guard named Private Miller. He could not have been more than 19. He had red hair and freckles and a nervous smile. He was assigned to watch the women during outdoor work details. Most of the time he just stood there looking bored. One day Greta was hanging laundry on the outdoor lines when a strong wind came up. Sheets whipped around, pulling free from the line. She struggled to catch them before they blew into the dirt. Private Miller set down his rifle and ran over to help. Together they caught the sheets and pinned them back up. When they finished, he gave her that nervous smile. "There you go," he said in English. Greta did not understand the words, but she understood the gesture. She nodded her thanks. For a moment they were just two people dealing with wind and laundry. The war seemed very far away. There was also Sergeant Harris, a middle-aged woman who oversaw the kitchen work detail. She was strict about rules, but not cruel. Once when one of the German women accidentally dropped a whole pot of soup, Sergeant Harris did not yell or punish her. She just helped clean it up and told her to be more careful next time. "In my kitchen we make mistakes and we learn," the translator repeated her words. "That is how it works." These small kindnesses were confusing. They did not match the propaganda. The The Americans were supposed to be brutal, violent, cruel. But these Americans were just people. Some were friendly, some were cold. Most were just doing their jobs with tired professionalism. Margaret struggled with this more than anyone. She had believed completely in what the Reich told them. America was the enemy. Americans were monsters. But here she was, working in the camp library, organizing books under the supervision of a kind American librarian who brought her coffee and asked about her life before the war. "I do not know who I am anymore," Margaret confessed to Greta one night. "Everything I was taught is wrong. Everything I believed is lies. If they are not monsters, then what were we fighting for? What did all those deaths mean?" Greta had no answer. She was asking herself the same questions. Winter came to Louisiana. Even in the South, it got cold at night. Not Hamburg cold, not the brutal, freezing cold that killed people in the ruins back home, but cold enough to need blankets, cold enough to see your breath in the morning. The barracks had heating, cast iron stoves that guards kept stocked with wood. The women gathered around them in the evenings, warming their hands and talking. These conversations grew deeper as time passed. The initial shock had worn off. Now came the harder work of understanding what it all meant. Some women clung to their old beliefs. A woman named Frida insisted that the good treatment was a trick. "They are fattening us up before they do something terrible," she warned. "This is psychological torture. They want us to feel grateful so we will betray our country." But most women could not sustain that level of suspicion. Months had passed. Nothing terrible had happened. They were still being fed, still being treated according to Geneva Convention rules, still being paid for their work. If this was a trick, it was the longest and most elaborate trick in history. Greta found herself in the middle ground. She was grateful for the food and shelter. How could she not be? But she also felt that gratitude was a betrayal. These were the people who had bombed her city, who had killed German soldiers, who had destroyed her country. How could she feel anything but hatred? Yet hatred was hard to maintain when your enemy gave you soap and bread. One evening a fight broke out in the barracks. Frida accused another woman, Anna, of becoming too friendly with the guards. "You smile at them," Frida hissed. "You laugh with them. Have you forgotten who they are? Have you forgotten what they did?" Anna, a young woman who worked in the kitchen, stood her ground. "What did they do? They fed us. They gave us clean clothes. They treat us like humans. Maybe you should ask what our own leaders did. Where were they when we were starving? Who ordered the destruction of our cities?" "That is treason," Frida shouted. "This whole situation is treason," Anna shot back. "We fought for a government that destroyed us, and now our enemies treat us better than our own leaders ever did. If that is not treason, I do not know what is." The argument was broken up by Margaret and others, but the damage was done. The divide in the barracks had been made clear. Some women would hold on to the old beliefs forever. Others were beginning to question everything. In late January, the camp showed a film. The guards set up a screen in one of the larger buildings and invited the prisoners to watch. It was an educational film about American democracy, about voting and freedom of speech and how the American government worked. Some women refused to go. Frida warned everyone that it was propaganda, designed to brainwash them. "Do not believe their lies," she said darkly. "This is how they corrupt your mind." But Greta was curious. She had never learned about other governments, only about how corrupt and evil they all were compared to Nazi Germany. But if that was true, why was Nazi Germany destroyed while America stood untouched? The film showed American cities full of people, stores full of food, families living in clean houses, schools full of children. Everything worked, everything functioned. The narrator talked about freedom and individual rights and the importance of questioning authority. One scene particularly struck Greta. It showed an American town meeting where citizens stood up and criticized their local government officials. The officials listened and responded. Nobody was arrested. Nobody disappeared. People disagreed openly and freely, and this was presented as normal, as healthy, as the way things should be. In Germany, criticism of the government meant prison or worse. Questioning authority was treason. But here it was considered a civic duty. The contrast was stark and deeply unsettling. Afterward, the women talked late into the night. The film had shaken something loose. If America was so weak and corrupt, how had it won? If Germany was so strong and superior, why had it lost? The questions had obvious answers, but accepting those answers meant accepting that everything they had been taught was wrong. "My father died in France," a woman named Elsa said quietly. "He died believing we were defending our homeland from evil. But what if we were the evil? What if we were wrong about everything?" No one answered. The question hung in the air like smoke. February brought more changes. The camp commander announced that prisoners could write more frequent letters home. They could also receive packages from the Red Cross. Some women were even allowed to take classes in English if they wanted to learn. Greta signed up for English classes. She told herself it was practical. She was a prisoner in America. She should learn the language. But really, she was curious. She wanted to understand these Americans better. She wanted to know how people who treated prisoners with such unexpected humanity could have been painted as monsters. The teacher was an American woman named Mrs. Patterson. She was in her 50s with gray hair and a patient smile. She taught them simple phrases. Hello. Thank you. Please. Good morning. The women repeated the words carefully, their German accents heavy but determined. One day, Mrs. Patterson brought in a book. It was a copy of the American Constitution, translated into German. She passed copies around and asked them to read certain sections. The words were strange. Rights, freedom, equality. These concepts had never been part of Greta's education. In America, Mrs. Patterson explained through the translator, we believe that all people are created equal, that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These rights cannot be taken away by any government. Margaret raised her hand. But you have prisons, she said carefully. You have prisoners. Like us. Mrs. Patterson nodded. Yes, but even prisoners have rights. Under our law, you must be treated humanely. You must be fed. You must be housed properly. You cannot be tortured or abused. Those rights remain, even in captivity. After class, Greta and Margaret walked slowly back to their barracks. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Margaret said, They treat us according to principles, not according to revenge or hatred. They treat us well because their law says they must, because they believe in something bigger than winning or losing. Yes, Greta agreed slowly. That is what I think too. Margaret stopped walking. She turned to face Greta. Do you understand what this means? It means they are showing us their strength. Not with bombs or guns, with mercy, with dignity. They are showing us that their way works, that their principles work, and we cannot argue because we are living proof. Greta nodded. She had been thinking the same thing for weeks. The Americans had won not just the war, but something deeper. They had won the moral argument. How could Germany claim superiority when it had destroyed itself? How could Nazi ideology claim strength when it had led to total defeat? And how could Greta hold on to hatred when her enemy treated her better than her own government ever had? Then came the night of December 14th. It was the coldest night of the year. An unusual cold front had swept down from the north, bringing temperatures that rarely reached Louisiana. By midnight, it was below freezing. Ice formed on the windows. Breath misted in the air inside the barracks. The women huddled under their 2 blankets, but it was not enough. The stove in the center of the barracks had gone out. Nobody had more wood to add. They lay in their bunks, shivering, trying to sleep despite the cold. Around midnight, Greta heard footsteps outside, heavy boots on frozen ground, multiple people. Her eyes snapped open in the darkness. Next to her, she heard Margaret sit up with a sharp intake of breath. The footsteps came closer, then stopped right outside their barracks. In the silence that followed, Greta could hear her own heartbeat. Around her, other women were waking up. Someone whispered, "What is happening?" Greta thought about everything she had heard. Stories from other wars. Stories about what happened to women prisoners in the night. Her hands gripped the edge of her blanket so tightly her knuckles ached. Next to her, Margaret was whispering a prayer under her breath. The door handle turned. The sound of metal scraping against metal seemed impossibly loud in the frozen silence. Several women gasped. One started crying quietly. Greta closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for whatever was coming. The door opened. Flashlight beams swept across the room. Guards stood in the doorway. 3 of them, 2 men and 1 woman. Greta's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The moment when the mask fell away and the true cruelty began. Midnight raid, armed guards, frozen prisoners in their beds. Every nightmare scenario flashed through her mind. Some women started crying. Frida, who had always predicted this, let out a sound like a wounded animal. "I told you," she sobbed. "I told you this would happen." But the guards were not carrying weapons. They were carrying something else. Greta squinted, trying to see in the dim light. Were those blankets? One of the male guards, a sergeant with a kind face, spoke in English. The female guard, who sometimes worked as a translator, repeated his words in German. "We noticed your stove went out. We brought extra blankets. The temperature is going to drop even more tonight. We do not want anyone to freeze." For a moment, absolute silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The words did not make sense. They had been bracing for violence, for punishment, for the thing they had feared since the day they were captured. And instead, the guards had brought blankets. The guards began moving through the barracks, handing out blankets, thick, heavy wool blankets that smelled like fresh laundry. They gave one to each woman. When the sergeant reached Greta's bunk, he held out a blanket. She took it with shaking hands. It was warm, heavy, real. She clutched it to her chest and felt tears burning in her eyes. The sergeant said something in English. The translator said, "Stay warm tonight. Try to sleep." Then the guards left. Just like that. They handed out blankets and left. No threats, no demands, no violence, just blankets and concern about the cold. When the door closed behind them, the barracks erupted. Women were crying, some hysterically. Others were laughing in disbelief. Some just sat there in stunned silence, holding their new blankets. Frida was sobbing uncontrollably. "I do not understand," she kept saying. "I do not understand. Why would they do this?" Margaret, sitting on her bunk with the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, spoke quietly. "Because this is who they are. This is their power. Not cruelty, not revenge, but this. Blankets in the middle of a cold night. Dignity when we expected humiliation. Humanity when we expected hate." Greta lay down, pulling both her old blankets and her new one over herself. The warmth was immediate, real, undeniable. She stared up at the ceiling and felt something break loose inside her. Not breaking apart, breaking free. All the propaganda, all the lies, all the hatred she had been taught to feel. It crumbled away in the face of this simple act. Guards bringing blankets to cold prisoners. Not because they had to, not because they were ordered to, but because it was the right thing to do. And in that moment, Greta understood something fundamental. The war was not just lost on battlefields, it was lost here, in this moment, when the enemy proved they were better than everything she had been told, when kindness defeated hatred, when dignity defeated propaganda. The Americans had won not just the military war, they had won the war of ideas, and they had won it with blankets. Spring came to Louisiana, the ice melted, trees bloomed, birds returned, and with the warm weather came news. Germany was opening up again. The occupation was stabilizing. Soon German prisoners would begin returning home. The announcement should have brought joy. Going home, seeing family, freedom. But instead, many women felt a complicated mix of emotions. Fear, anxiety, and something nobody wanted to admit out loud. Reluctance. "I am afraid," Margaret confessed to Greta one evening as they sat outside watching the sunset. "What will I say to my daughter? How do I explain that I was treated better as a prisoner than she was treated as a free German?" Greta understood completely. "My mother will see how healthy I look, how my face is filled out. She will know I was eating well while they starved. The guilt is unbearable." "It is more than guilt," Margaret said. "It is knowing that everything we believed was wrong, everything we fought for was a lie. How do we go back and live with that knowledge?" Over the following weeks, the women prepared for repatriation. They packed their few belongings. They said goodbye to the guards and staff who had treated them well. Some women exchanged addresses, promising to write. Others simply left, unable to process the emotions. On her last night at Camp Ruston, Greta lay in her bunk under the extra blanket the guards had brought that cold December night. She'd kept it. They had let her keep it. One last act of unexpected kindness. The ship that took them back to Germany was crowded and uncomfortable. Nothing like the treatment they had received in America. But that was understandable. Resources were limited. The voyage was just transport, nothing more. They landed in Bremen in June 1946. The women stepped off the ship and stared at what remained of Germany. The destruction was worse than they remembered. More complete, more devastating. Everything was gray and broken and dead. From Bremen, Greta made her way to Hamburg. The journey took 3 days by various trains and trucks. When she finally reached what had been her neighborhood, she could not find her street. The landmarks were gone. Everything was rubble. She walked through streets that no longer existed, trying to orient herself by memory. Where the bakery had been, there was now just a pile of bricks. The church was a hollow shell. The school was completely gone. She felt like a ghost walking through the ruins of her own life. Finally, she found someone who recognized her, an old woman who had lived down the street. The woman told her where to find her family. "The basement of the old Schneider building," she said, pointing with a shaking hand. "That is where they are, if they are still alive." She found her family living in the basement of a destroyed apartment building. Her mother looked 20 years older. Her brothers were thin and worn, but they were alive. When her mother saw her, she began crying and did not stop for an hour. They held each other in the dim basement, surrounded by the few possessions they had managed to salvage. A broken table, some blankets, a small stove that barely worked. This was what remained of their life. This was survival. Her younger brother, Klaus, stared at her with wide eyes. "You look so healthy," he said. It was not an accusation, just an observation. But it landed like a punch. Because he was right. She looked healthy, well-fed, strong, while he looked like a skeleton with skin stretched over it. That night, sitting in the cold basement by candlelight, they asked Greta about America, about the prison camp, about how she had been treated. She tried to explain, but the words felt wrong. How could she tell them about 3 meals a day? About hot showers and soap? About being paid to work and buying chocolate? About guards bringing blankets in the night? Her mother noticed her hesitation. They treated you badly? She asked fearfully. No, Greta said quietly. That is the problem. They treated me well. Better than well, they treated me with dignity and kindness, and I cannot reconcile that with everything we were told. Her mother was silent for a long moment. Then she said, Perhaps that is the lesson we were meant to learn. That the world is not as simple as we were told. That our enemies were more human than our leaders. The years passed. Germany rebuilt slowly. Greta found work in an office. She married a man who had survived the Eastern Front. They had 2 children. Life went on, as life does. But the war never truly left her. How could it? She carried it in her memories, in her dreams, in the way she reacted to certain sounds or smells. The scent of laundry soap always brought her back to that shower room in Camp Ruston. The feel of a wool blanket always reminded her of that cold December night. Her husband understood in his own way. He had his own scars, his own memories that would not fade. They did not talk about the war much. What was there to say? They had both survived. That was enough. But she never forgot. The soap, the food, the blankets. These simple things stayed with her more powerfully than memories of war. They represented something bigger than kindness. They represented the defeat of everything she had been taught to believe. She stayed in touch with Margaret, who had settled in West Berlin. They wrote letters back and forth, sharing memories and reflections. In one letter, Margaret wrote something that stayed with Greta forever. The Americans defeated us twice. Once on the battlefield with their weapons, and once in the prison camp with their principles. The second defeat was more complete than the first, because weapons can only destroy, but principles can transform. They showed us what we could have been, what we should have been, and that knowledge is both a gift and a burden we will carry forever. Sometimes, late at night when she could not sleep, Greta would think about the choices that had led to the war, the propaganda, the hatred, the belief that some people were superior to others, all the lies that had seemed so convincing at the time. And she would wonder how many lives could have been saved if people had simply chosen kindness over cruelty, dignity over domination, humanity over hatred. These were not easy thoughts. They came with guilt and shame and regret, but they also came with wisdom. The hard-earned wisdom of someone who had believed lies and lived to see the truth, who had been saved not by her own side, but by the enemy, who had learned that the world was far more complicated than any propaganda could capture. Many years later, when Greta was in her 60s, her granddaughter asked about the war. They were sitting in Greta's small apartment in Hamburg, drinking tea. The girl was studying history in school and had questions about the past. "Grandmother," the girl asked, "were you afraid when you were a prisoner in America?" Greta thought for a long moment. "Yes," she finally said. "I was terrified, but not of what actually happened. I was afraid of cruelty that never came, of hatred that was never shown. The guards brought us blankets in the middle of a cold night, and that act of simple humanity broke something inside me. It broke my hatred, and I have lived with that broken hatred ever since." "Is that bad?" her granddaughter asked. "No," Greta said, smiling sadly. "It is the best thing that could have happened. Hatred is easy to carry. It burns hot and feels powerful. But broken hatred, defeated by kindness, that teaches you something important. It teaches you that the world is more complicated than propaganda, that enemies can be more humane than friends. That dignity matters more than victory." She still had the blanket. It was old now, worn and faded, but she kept it folded in her closet. Sometimes she would take it out and hold it, remembering that cold December night, remembering the footsteps outside, the fear, the door opening, the guards with their arms full of wool blankets. That moment had changed her forever, not because it was cruel, but because it was kind. And kindness, she had learned, is far more powerful than cruelty could ever be, and so the blanket became more than wool and fabric. It became a symbol of something larger. Proof that enemies can show mercy, evidence that humanity persists even in war, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapons are not guns or bombs, but simple acts of unexpected kindness. For Greta and the other women at Camp Ruston, that cold December night represented a turning point. They had expected the worst. They had prepared for cruelty. Instead, they received warmth, and in receiving it, they were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their enemies had treated them with more dignity than their own leaders ever had. The paradox haunted them for the rest of their lives. They had been fed while their families starved, sheltered while their cities burned, treated humanely while their countrymen suffered. This inversion of expectations broke something fundamental. It shattered the propaganda that had shaped their worldview. In the end, America won not just through military might, it won through the consistent application of principles, through following rules even when dealing with enemies, through showing that dignity and mercy are not weaknesses but strengths, through proving that a nation's true power lies not in how it treats its friends, but but in how it treats its prisoners. The women of Camp Rustin carried this lesson for the rest of their lives, and in doing so they became witnesses to an important historical truth, that war is fought not just on battlefields but in the human heart, and that sometimes the battles fought in the heart matter more than the battles fought with weapons. As Greta once wrote in a letter to Margaret, "They defeated us with blankets. How do you fight back against that? How do you maintain hatred when your enemy keeps showing you kindness? You cannot." And maybe that was the point. Maybe mercy was always their most powerful weapon. This is a story worth remembering, not because it is unique, but because it represents something fundamental about humanity. Even in our darkest moments, even in the midst of total war, we are capable of treating each other with dignity. We are capable of choosing kindness over cruelty. We are capable of seeing the humanity in our enemies. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more true accounts from World War II. These stories buried in history still speak to us today about courage, humanity, and the complex truth that exists beyond propaganda. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.